Hello, everyone. I'm Yuval Levin. I'm Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion of Congress Overwhelmed, a new book edited by Kevin Kosar, Lee Drutman, and Timothy LaPira. Congress stands at the heart of our constitutional system. It is the first branch in more ways than one, or at least it's supposed to be. But in our time, Congress often seems dysfunctional, broken down, even irresponsible. Some observers point to partisanship or polarization as a cause. Other people talk about the temptations of populism or performative politics. Scholars might point to historical or institutional causes. This new volume points to a crucial and underappreciated additional reason why Congress is struggling so much. It doesn't have the internal capacity to do what we demand of it. These essays chronicle the institutional decline of Congress and the decades-long failure to invest in the knowledge and expertise necessary for it to perform as a first-rate legislature. A lack of staff, of experience, and of resources too often leaves Congress at the mercy of lobbyists and of the executive bureaucracy. We'll hear from the book's editors about why that has happened and what might be done about it. Our format is very simple. I will introduce our three panelists. They'll each speak for a bit about an element of the argument advanced in the book. And then the four of us will take up a discussion. And at the end, there will also be an opportunity for all of you to engage with the panel in Q&A. There are two ways that you can ask a question, by email or through Twitter. You can email your question to Elaine Allen, whose email is Elaine, ELAYNE.Allen, ALLEN, @AEI.org, or you can tweet them at us with the hashtag AEI Congress Overwhelmed. The editors of the volume are three great scholars of Congress and American government. Kevin Kosar is a resident scholar here at AEI, studying Congress, the separation of powers, political reform, and related issues. He's worked at the R Street Institute and at the Congressional Research Service, and his writings have appeared in many publications, both academic and general. Lee Drutman is a senior fellow in the political reform program at New America. He's the author, most recently, of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, which I very highly recommend to you. And he writes widely on the challenges facing American democracy. And Timothy LaPira is a professor of political science at James Madison University in Virginia, who studies Congress, interest groups, and lobbying. He's the author, most recently, of Revolving Door Lobbying, and he's served as the American Political Science Association Public Service Fellow at the House Select Committee on the Modernization of the Congress. The three of them bring enormous experience and expertise to the table, and the book they've edited is a wonderful new resource for students of Congress. We'll hear about different facets of it from each of them, and we'll start with Kevin Kosar. So Kevin, the floor is yours.
Right. Well, thank you, Yuval, and thank you to all of you who are in the audience. I'm delighted that we're here to celebrate the release of this new book, which has chapters written by top scholars on Congress. It's been a long time coming. Lee, Tim, and I put in a ton of work to get this book together, but we couldn't have done it without the help of the roughly 24 contributors to the volume. So thank you to them too. Now, before I go further, I want to give you a simple roadmap of what I'm going to talk about in brief and what Lee and Tim will address in their remarks. My comments are going to focus on the origins of this book. Why did we put this thing together? Lee's going to talk about the overarching conceptual framework, which is congressional capacity. Then Tim is going to discuss the survey of congressional staff and the great trove of information and data that we put together that was drawn upon by many of the scholars who contributed to this volume. So let me get to the why. Why another book on Congress? Well, the origin of this book goes back 5 years to a coffee I had with Lee Drutman, who was at that time a stranger to me. We had, of all things, interacted on Twitter. I had been writing out there about the Congressional Review Act and how Congress could use its lawmaking authority to strike down regulations. Lee tweeted in response to me and asked whether it was a good thing for Congress to do if it was being goaded to overturn regulations by entrenched political interests with deep pockets. It's a fair question. And rather than debate it over social media, we decided to get coffee together. It was one of the best decisions I've made in recent years. What emerged from that coffee chat was that, although Lee looks at things from the left and I look at things from the right, we both shared the same perspective that Congress as an institution was struggling. And while we both agreed that part of the failure is due to the individuals in it and that identified factors like polarization were playing a role in it. We also had the same perspective that there seemed to be failure caused by the structure of the institution itself. Put most broadly, the world around the institution of Congress has changed, but the institution itself has not been reorganized and upgraded so that it can have a real chance to respond to the demands being placed upon it and to meet the public's expectations. And this kind of meta problem, this big overarching problem, we termed congressional capacity. And Lee's going to tell you a bit more about that shortly. Now, we both felt that this was a real problem for representative democracy. You just don't have a representative democracy if you don't have a well-functioning legislature. When the founders wrote the Constitution, they very much expected the legislature to be the heart of the federal governing apparatus. But to anybody who looks upon it, that's just doesn't appear to be the case. The whole separation of power system is, out of balance, with more and more power flowing to the other branches, and Congress looking increasingly irrelevant. Now, Lee and I, discussed the fact that in the past, when Congress had sort of slid into dysfunction and weakness, it would reorganize itself. It would strengthen itself vis-a-vis the executive branch by changing its internal structures and processes. It would add new staff. It would do all sorts of stuff to enable ambition to counter ambition, and for the legislature to do stuff to represent the people. We also knew that the last time that Congress reorganized itself in a significant way was in the early 1970s. So sometime after that coffee, we decided to launch kind of an amalgamated project. It would include producing scholarship that examined what was working and not working in Congress. It would also aim to spark Congress to think about how to reform itself and hopefully take action. So in December 2015, we held the first meeting of what would become the Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group, this kind of monthly gathering of folks on the Hill, staffers, journalists, scholars, anybody who cares about Congress. They just come and we pick a topic to talk about that day and to dive into. This very first panel that we did on Capitol Hill featured Yuval, Lee, Brookings Institution's Jonathan Rauch, Molly Reynolds, Washington Monthly's editor Paul Glastris, and myself. And to our delight, more than 100 congressional staff and other folks showed up to that panel about how to reassert Congress as a branch. And that event really showed us that we had tapped into an unmet demand on a Hill, which in my decade of working at the Congressional Research Service was overwhelming to me. This feeling amongst congressional staff and legislators that they were just trapped in this institution where they couldn't do the things that they were sent to Washington to do. And they were, quite frankly, encouraged to do things that, were mostly short term and that they often didn't like to do. So that panel was a smashing success. And a few months later, we decided to have another gathering of the Ledge Branch Capacity Working Group. And one of its attendees was Professor Tim LaPira. And after the event, he came up to us and talked. And next thing you know, emails were flying back and forth over the subsequent weeks between the three of us. And it was clear suddenly that we had the essential pieces to move forward a conversation about Congress and how it might be reformed, one that was informed by research, not ideology, and that aimed to produce analyses that could be translated into action by legislators and their staffs. And that's what we've been going at for 5 years now. And Congress Overwhelmed, this book, is our most recent and our largest research project. And I hope folks like it and think it's valuable. And let me pause there and turn over the microphone to my colleague and friend Lee Drutman, who can tell you about the big concept of the book, congressional capacity.
Yes, well, thank you, Kevin. And I'm certainly glad we decided to have that coffee I think it was at the Pete's at 17th and L, back when people got together for coffee to discuss ideas, which maybe we'll do again sometime. So I want to really dig into this idea of congressional capacity. And we hear a lot of conversations. It has almost become a sort of de rigueur point to say that Congress doesn't work, Congress is broken, Congress has given up its constitutional role. We've been hearing about the broken branch, at least for a decade and a half, since Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein wrote a book of that name. And I think what we've really dug into in the legislative branch capacity working group and this volume, Congress Overwhelmed, is kind of a basic claim that Congress lacks the fundamental knowledge and resources to perform its legislative and oversight duties. And this isn't to blame individual members or I think there's often a kind of narrative that tends to say, well, members of Congress just need to buck up and get their act together. But what we're trying to do in this larger body of work is to just understand the environment in which members of Congress and their staff are working in, and the extent to which we're kind of asking them to do the impossible. I've been thinking about this in the context of this pandemic this year, in which we've been asking doctors and medical workers to do the truly exceptional, and we don't say, well, they should do it on the cheap. They should just make do with whatever they have. We say we need to get them the resources to do the essential work that they need to do to protect and save people's lives. And Congress is an essential institution. It's the way that we come together as Americans with our diverse concerns and interests and values, and collectively decide how to allocate public resources, how to set the rules by which we live. And yet we've been trying to do it on the cheap for a really long time, and we kind of get what we pay for when we complain about how Congress doesn't work. So certainly polarization is an important part of the problem, and hyperpartisanship is an important part of the problem. And as you've all mentioned, I've written an entire book on the problem of polarization, breaking the two-party doom loop. But one of the reasons that I started to care about partisanship and polarization so much in the first place was because I cared about Congress. And I wanted the institution to work. And so the polarization is one thing that we talk a lot about, but Congress also needs the basic capacity, the resources. Put simply, individual members and their staff just don't have the time and the expertise to really fully understand the problems that they're attempting to resolve. And what's the consequence of that? Consequence is that Congress and members and staff have to rely on other sources of expertise that are dependent on the executive branch staff, who they're supposed to check and balance. They're dependent on outside lobbyists who tend to represent narrow, predominantly business interests, which if you're interested in more on that, I also wrote a book on that called The Business of America is Lobbying. And add this all up, and it really undermines the effective functioning and independent judgment of Congress, and really leads to policies that do not reflect the broader judgment and values of the American people, but instead respond to narrow and well-resourced interests. So what we are really trying to add here is, in some ways, what might be a fundamental point is that people matter, because it's ultimately people who make decisions. And if Congress wants to underpay its staff and not invest in knowledge capacity, it will get a rotating cast of 26-year-olds, bright and energetic and smart as they might be, who just don't have that depth of both substantive knowledge and institutional knowledge, and are just there for the short term, as opposed to having a long-term investment in the institution and the relationships and the policy areas and the subject matter. And it's easy to blame. Again, I do want to emphasize that it's easy to blame the members of Congress themselves, for not really engaging in the substance. But the substance is complex. And what we really should be blaming members for is the idea that they are not giving themselves the tools that they need to make public policy on the best public policy that they can, just as we would not expect our doctors to attend to COVID patients without vaccines, which we're working on, or without ventilators, or without PPE. We should not expect Congress to really engage in the complex problem solving and deliberation. I think the idea of a Congress, of a pluralistic legislative institution, is that it's a place where people go to deliberate. And in order to deliberate intelligently and to argue and debate the merits of policy intelligently, you need to be able to draw on a large degree of knowledge and wide-ranging expertise. And Congress has really given itself a lobotomy over many decades. So if we want to have a vision of a Congress that's a genuine deliberative institution that works to take into consideration a broad diversity of perspectives and builds legitimacy for public policy, there needs to be a genuine deliberative process that reflects the best information, that brings the opportunity for lasting agreement. So I think there's an old saying in political science that Congress is not an it, Congress is a they, and sometimes that's meant to kind of describe the fact that there are 435 members of the House and 100 members of Congress who operate somewhat independently, but it also needs to reflect the understanding that working alongside those members are staffers who have their own incentives and their own knowledge, and collectively, it's not just the 535 members of Congress, but the thousands of staff as well, who collectively decide and deliberate and weigh the merits of all kinds of public policies. So when we think about what we want Congress to be, we have to give it the tools and resources and fundamentally the capacity to live up to that expectation. And we need to understand that we can't do Congress on the cheap. And this book is really about the ways in which Congress has fallen down in many areas, but it's also a fundamental recognition that behind all of those problems is a lack of capacity. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tim, who's going to talk a little bit more about how we did the research around this volume and some of the things that are in this important volume.
Thank you, Lee. And I'll echo Kevin's comment on his making such an excellent decision to sit down and have coffee with Lee, which is ultimately ended up in what we believe is the most comprehensive study of congressional capacity ever conducted. So this started, as Kevin and Lee had suggested, as I attended one of these events on Capitol Hill and approached the two after and said, we have a really strong hunch of what the problem is, but we don't necessarily know in such detail systematically about what that is. Anecdotes of staff looking to leave the institution, some information on how and why legislative staff very easily go through the so-called revolving door to become lobbyists and then ultimately write the legislation. But we did not have any systematic way of deeply understanding the nature of the problem, but also we needed to build up a systematic evidence that could lead us to some conclusions and reform suggestions. Right. So to do this, we joined with Alex Hertel-Fernandez and Alexander Furness. The five of us developed a protocol of a large-scale study that consisted of two stages. In the first stage, we interviewed more than 60 current and former members of Congress and senior staff, typically staff that have some sort of supervisory or budget authority, in their respective offices, as Lee was suggesting Congress is today, to see how they all operated, some of the strategies that they were developing in order to deal with their heavily constrained resources. And it was really expansive. We talked to people in both chambers, in members' personal offices, in committees, and in party leadership on both sides of the aisle. And some key themes came out of this first stage. One, that there was a near universal desire to hire more policy staff. They need more experts because the turnover of staff is so high. But at the same time, there's no resources to do so. So the writing on the wall in Capitol Hill is that members and committee leaders and party leaders really ought to be directing their public resources more towards so-called representational activities as opposed to legislative or policy activities. Representational activities, of course, will include constituent service, which is an absolute necessary aspect of a member of Congress's job, but also communications and public relations. And in the world today, where we live in a world of social media, 24-hour news, cable news, that there is a much greater need today than the last time Congress was reformed, as Kevin mentioned, in the 1970s, where that was geared more towards legislating and oversight. The problem that many supervisors pointed out was that, unlike in a business or even a nonprofit, or frankly, even a federal agency or a bureaucracy, is that Congress has one benchmark: re-election, and that is it. So, and re-election, of course, is a function of many different factors, and probably not necessarily how well their offices are operating. So one of the desires that we heard was to really develop some better metrics to understand how staff do their work, how members supervise their own staff, how members serve as their own staffers, as well as other sort of technological and information technology solutions, so that Congress can get down to doing the business that it needs to do. Stage two, after we learned all this, it was very informative. That helped us develop a survey of all staff. So we sent out a survey. We had, as far as I know, one of the largest responses to a survey of congressional staff, of more than 450 staffers. And we found out a few things. I'm not going to go through everything, but one, Congress is, perhaps not surprisingly, staffed primarily by millennials. 60% of staff in Congress are under the age of 35. 75% are under the age of 40. The average tenure on Capitol Hill is only about 3 years. So we're talking about 1.5 Congresses. And at the time that we surveyed people, roughly 43% indicated that they plan to depart Congress at the end of the current session. Now just imagine that. Imagine if there was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, had 2/5 of their employees indicating that they wanted to quit by the end of the business cycle. I can't imagine that that CEO would last very long, yet Congress gets away with it. So we wanted to try to think more clearly about, well, what could we get to change the attitude here? And some of the things that we settled on was simply trying to understand how Congress does its job cannot be divorced from how the rest of the government, as well as the private sector and the advocacy community and the lobbying community in Washington, that it's just one, frankly, large labor market, and that Congress is being consistently beaten by others to get really highly expert people to not only to hire, but to also to retain them. So we know this, and we know that members of Congress definitely seek experienced staff, but they don't have the resources to actually reward that. So it should be no surprise to anybody that the best and the brightest spend a few years on the Hill, build that resume up, and then leave for salaries that could be double or triple what they could earn on the Hill. So with all this information, we engaged in what is, I like to think is an innovative approach to doing an edited volume, is that we had this fabulous new data set of information from staff that was unavailable anywhere else. And we contacted some of the best Congress minds in the country and said, here's the data, see what you want to, what you can do with it. And let's collectively come up with some of the most interesting empirical findings that can help us help inform how we might go about fixing what is broken, right? So of the 17 chapters, 5 or 6 of the chapters use these data, including Chris Miller from Maryland, looks really closely at policy process knowledge. Jesse Crossan, Jeff Lorenz, and the Center for Effective Lawmaking directors, Greg Bolden and Alan Wiseman, look at how experienced staff help members, especially early in their career, suggesting that staff are indeed the holders of institutional knowledge. Laura Harbridge-Young looks at the relationship between capacity and bipartisanship. So the point here is that these data allowed some of the best minds on Congress to tackle some of these really important questions in new and interesting ways. In addition to many of the chapters that use these data, other scholars brought their own and together make it really a rich volume that includes a number of things, including Molly Reynolds looks at long-term decline in staffing using vital statistics on Congress data. Scott Adler and colleagues from the University of Colorado look at their unique data set on legislative authorizations and members' ability to essentially keep up with the law. Ruth Block Rubin looks at moments of congressional reform in the past and to see what lessons it might have as we move on. Francis Lee and Jim Curry, great scholars of party leaders, look at the relationship between party leaders and what legislation is possible given the current state of congressional capacity. So overall, this book taken together really is covers just about every angle we could. And I think readers and reformers and hopefully members of Congress out there themselves stand to learn a lot, as I did in working with Kevin and Lee and all of our contributors. So we hope you learn something from it as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much to all three of you. A wonderful overview of what's in the book and how the book came to be. I'll put a couple of questions to you, but then we're already starting to get a fair number of questions from people watching, and so I'll make sure you get those too, and we'll dig a little deeper. I'll start with you, Kevin, although certainly this is open to everybody too after that. Is this diagnosis shared in Congress? That is, if you asked members or staff with some experience what challenges they face, would they talk about capacity? Would they talk about the need for more resources, for more people? Is this how they tend to think about what's wrong with the institution that they are part of?
Yes, to a degree. In terms of the day-to-day workflow, I mean, members certainly feel overwhelmed. I mean, the idiom of drinking from a fire hose is spouted by just about everybody down there because they feel like so many things are coming at them so fast that they just can't, they don't have the capacity to respond. They don't have enough staff. They don't have the technology to deal with the crush of constituent complaints. They just feel like they're torn in so many directions. You know, one small example, members of Congress find it, particularly in the House, find it extraordinarily frustrating that they're often scheduled to be in multiple committee hearings at the same time. You know, you're trying to dig into some difficult, deep topic, engage in oversight and do what's right, make policy. And you know, you're in for 15 minutes and the next thing you know, an aide is pulling you and saying, well, you got to get across the other way to another meeting because there might be a vote or something is happening there. And, you know, it's the old wisdom of one of the ancients who said to be everywhere is to be nowhere. And I think that's the way many members feel. But they certainly do cite the kind of toxic, relentless partisanship And, these are folks who are not creatures of DC. They come from all over the country. And when they get here and they see things that are straightforward, that can be addressed, and nothing is being done just because, one party wants to stick it to the other party, they find that extraordinarily frustrating. But yeah, their operating environment, they're greatly frustrated by.
Thoughts from the other two of you on this? In conversations with members or with staff, did they raise this or did you raise this?
Yeah, I would say one thing that I recognized when speaking with members and senior staff was that most members who are in Congress today have been in Congress for less than 10 years. They've never experienced a high functioning Congress that existed as recently as the early mid-1990s, and certainly not at its peak of the 1970s and 1980s, when when Congress was. There's many reasons for that, and polarization is certainly a factor. The competition between the parties for majority control every election cycle was not necessarily a factor back then. But also when new members of Congress arrived in Washington, their job was to legislate primarily. Today, members of Congress' primary job is to raise money and get reelected. So I think we need to recognize that at least part of this is context driven, and that new members that come to Congress, come to Capitol Hill these days, are socialized into a system that is not going to prioritize the capacity for legislation and oversight.
Mm-hmm. Lee, let me put a question to you. You mentioned in your remarks that Congress has given itself a lobotomy, and that points to the peculiar fact about resource problems in Congress, which is that Congress resources itself. If it's lacking in resources, it can only turn to its own process of legislation to provide itself with more resources. So how have we gotten to this point? Why has Congress given itself a lobotomy? What's the story, the history, the process that got us to a place where an institution that can address its own lack of resources has chosen not to and has left itself short?
Yeah, well, there's a few. I mean, well, one, it is a great question because this is one problem that Congress actually could fix very easily, and the congressional budget, total budget for the House and the Senate is a little over $2 billion, which is a rounding error in the overall federal budget. But part of the story is the centralization of power in Congress, in that in the 70s and into the 80s, when Congress really did invest in expertise and knowledge, a lot of that expertise and knowledge lived in committees and subcommittees, which did real things like holding lots of legislative hearings and doing lots of oversight. And that created some independent sources of power that party leaders didn't have as much control over. And there's a caricature version of that which puts all the blame on Newt Gingrich, and certainly I think he deserves a fair amount of blame for slashing committee budgets and independent sources of expertise when he took over as Speaker. But it's part of a larger trend, and that happened in the Senate as well, in that as Congress became more centralized, more partisan, the party leaders didn't want to have as many sources of independent expertise. And Congress is dealing with so many issues that it's hard to process everything in a serial way. What Congress as an institution works best as a parallel processing institution, but when you shut down the resources for the committees, that makes it harder for Congress to have capacity to deal with a lot of issues. And then the other aspect of it is that a lot of members of Congress are scared of their own shadows sometimes, and are worried that they're going to face some challenge based on the fact that they increased the budget of Congress. And they're so scared to invest in Congress as an institution because they spend so much time running against Congress, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. That, I mean, frankly, the types of people who run for Congress often are people who are not invested in Congress as an institution, but they're to sort of kind of draw on your work, Yuval, they're interested in Congress as a platform to launch their own career. And so there's a sort of broader story about the institutional power shifting within Congress. And there's a story about the types of people who are running for Congress and how they see their role. And those two kind of play on each other and reinforce each other. So I certainly had numerous conversations with staff for a wide range of members, who all say, yeah, of course we need more money. Well, why doesn't your boss support that? Well, he doesn't want to get out in front and, lead on that because, he's afraid that he would face a primary challenge or somebody would say that he's, investing. In fact, members of Congress instead boast how they're sending money back to the Treasury, which is, it's like dropping a bucket of, dropping a piece of sand into onto a beach when they're giving that money back. But, it makes for good PR. So, I mean, part of the challenge is just that if nobody stands up for Congress as an institution, not even members of Congress, because they're not really invested in Congress as an institution. And I think that points to a really deep problem that is really hard to change.
Tim, you mentioned in particular in your remarks the challenge of churn among the staff, of people staying a very short time and not thinking of themselves as there to stay. Is that the chief driver of the problem you think of as the lack of resources? Is it a matter of not having the expertise? And if that's so, what would you do? Is it really just a matter of paying people better so that they stay rather than go and lobby? Is that where people go when they churn out of Congress? How do you think about the staff churn problem?
Typically, yes, they're going into lobbying and they're doing it for money. I don't want to overcomplicate what the underlying problem is. Though I do think the solution is more than just pay staff more. What Congress needs to do is make the institution an attractive place for highly qualified people to make a career out of their time there, not simply a line on the resume. So I think this would require a really comprehensive strategy to both recruit and retain people that is not really all that different than what the private sector might do. So right now, to get a job on Capitol Hill, the typical way to get a job on Capitol Hill is to be young, perhaps just graduated college, and be willing to work in a so-called internship for 1 or 2 after you graduate, making very little or no money at all, so probably working part-time somewhere else, until you can break through into an entry-level position, which those positions have turnover of somewhere between 3 to 6 months. So they're, which tells you that's not a fun job to have. And until you land in a mid-level sort of policy position or a press secretary position or something along those lines, that at that point, what we see is people really enjoy working on Congress. The work that Congress does, even though it might be vilified in the media, is rewarding, it's satisfying, and it really is important. And that includes the non-sexy kinds of legislation and dirty work and oversight and really digging down into budget lines that really only comes with experience. So typically what is going to happen is most staff are going to leave after a few years because they can't really dig their teeth into doing too many things because not much is happening, right? So if we're only passing one spending bill at the end of the year in order to keep the government open, there's not much room for real work there. But that experience all of a sudden becomes very valuable. So staffers do a very a simple cost-benefit analysis and say, well, am I going to still be able to continue doing what I believe is important work? But if I can go do it for 3 times my salary, there's really no question there. That said, I do believe there is some kind of X factor here that would likely keep people there, and it is really what is attracting both members and staff to the institution to begin with. What Congress is not doing is taking advantage of that X factor, that public service motivation that is intrinsic to nearly everyone who works on Capitol Hill. So marginally increasing pay, that would make a few people happy, but I don't know that it's going to keep them there. And if you want to increase average pay for a staffer on the Hill, well, the problem there is that senior staff salary is going to run up right against a member of Congress's salary. Ask a member of Congress if they're willing to vote to raise their own salary. It's a lose-lose vote. And for many years, Congress had set up a cost of living increase of their own salary that automatically bumped them up so they wouldn't have to deal with that problem all the time. That ended in the Great Recession, 2008, and they never returned to that process. So I think it would be a comprehensive plan to first deal with members' pay. Members are wealthy anyway. It doesn't really matter, but what's really driving it is it's keeping all but the most senior staffers from staying. So if you move the goalpost a little bit, raise the ceiling a little bit, you can address that. But in addition to that, Congress needs to treat its workers using best practices from any corporation or nonprofit around the country that does a number of good things to keep the workers, and it's not always pay. So there could be a number of things that Congress could do in order to fix both the ceiling and that entry point to make working in Congress something that should be a goal should be for people to spend a good chunk of their career, 5, 10, 15 years. That would go a long way to really maintaining that institutional knowledge that lies in staff.
Let me start to bring in some audience questions. We've got quite a number of them, and they fall into a few categories that I'm going to try to tie some things together. But Kevin, I'll start with you with a question from David Schoenbrod, who asked about cause and effect in a sense. He says, is it that the lack of capacity causes Congress to avoid the big hard choices, or is it that the members' desire to avoid the big hard choices and to evade personal responsibility for them leads them to fail to provide themselves with the necessary capacity and to think about establishing a system that lets Congress focus on the most important public issues? Is capacity the cause or the effect of the dysfunction that we find in Congress?
And I guess my answer to David would be yes. It can certainly work on both sides of the equation. I mean, we know it's indisputable that there are some choices that are just difficult, and members of Congress are afraid to vote yes or vote no, and they'll do any number of things to try to reduce the salience so that they don't face blowback, because they're kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. And sometimes that means not showing up for a vote. Sometimes it means making sure an issue doesn't even come up on the calendar. Sometimes it involves symbolic activity where you get up and offer an amendment or something of that ilk. Big problem like the health of Social Security, the debt, things involving, deficits. Those are often awful for members of Congress. They feel like they just can't win on them. So yeah, they dodge those questions, and that's just them following the incentives. But all the other stuff, engaging in oversight. Well, why would anybody want to engage in oversight? It's possible that they're just a good government sort of person and feel ethically obliged to do it, but they also might think that it's going to benefit them in some way. And this gets back to the Madisonian idea that a member's interests need to connect to the kind of position that they hold. Well, why would you engage in oversight and try to change the way an executive branch agency is operating or alter a policy if it's just an overwhelming task? If you don't have enough staff if you're, in a system where the legislative procedure for getting something enacted into law or turning off the spigot of money to a failed program is impossible to operate. You just kind of throw up your hands and don't do it. And that's why, when I think about capacity, I don't want the audience to get the idea that we're emphasizing, oh, it's just staff and it's just money. I think about it like a firm. Can this firm do its job? Is it organized the right way? Does it have the right people? Does it have the right procedures? Are the incentives structured the right way? And incentives are something that David's actually written a lot about. And incentives and altering the structures of the system so that the incentives line up better for members is a truly key part of congressional reform.
Raise another question from another scholar of Congress, maybe at first for you, Lee. This is from Thomas Main from the City University of New York. And it's actually a question that a number of other people have raised in different ways, of whether one way to deal with the capacity issue is to expect and ask Congress to do less than we now expect and ask it to do, whether that's by way of moving some of the responsibility to executive agencies, where maybe there's less room for direct lobbying and maybe there's more capacity that Congress could benefit from indirectly. Or maybe, as another viewer of ours, Frank Baxter, asks, maybe part of the solution would be more federalism, passing more responsibility to state governments and elsewhere. Is the availability of capacity, does it point simply to the need for greater congressional capacity, or does it point toward a need to pass along some of what we now demand of Congress to other parts of our system?
Well, a legislature, and particularly a national legislature, is a unique institution. And it is at the center of every modern democracy. There are, certainly there are certain issues that can be dealt with at the state and local level, but there are, to the extent that our economy is truly nationalized, and that so much power is now at the federal level, and and unwinding that power, I think, would be very difficult. That we have to really resolve a lot of these issues in a national legislature. Certainly there are some who have called for more of powers of Congress to just be given over directly to the executive branch. Some of that has just happened de facto because Congress has just not used its powers and the executive branch has taken them. But I think that is very dangerous because that centralizes even more power in a winner-take-all institution. And if you look at countries with very strong executives and very strong presidential systems, they are deeply unstable, especially pluralistic societies like ours, because that just concentrates a tremendous amount of power in one unitary office. And certainly to have a diverse country as ours is in both geography and culture is a real challenge, and that's why Congress is such an important institution, because it's really the only institution that is able to kind of connect directly with people everywhere and take their perspectives and values to one place and hash things out. And to do that, it is no easy task. It requires tremendous capacity. And certainly, I just think that the short answer is that there are a lot of things that only a national legislature and a national Congress can do. And we need to accept that and give Congress the resources it needs to do that.
Mm-hmm. Tim, a question for you from Susan Jean Irving. She points to the work of the Select Committee on Modernizing Congress and suggests that some of the concerns you raise here are like those that the committee is trying to take up. How do you think about the differences between your diagnosis and prescriptions here and the work that the committee has been doing so far?
The committee has been very successful in identifying, frankly, low-hanging fruit and solution and problems that have fairly straightforward and bipartisan solutions. Those are few and far between, however. The committee came up with nearly 100 recommendations, several of them dealing directly addressing many of the capacity issues that we're talking about now. But they are merely that, recommendations. What we need is two things. One would be for Congress to, especially in the new Congress, going into the 117th Congress, to adopt many of those recommendations into their daily operations, into their rules, but more importantly, simply to prioritize simple things like centralizing human resources and trying to pay staff more. What the select committee was not in a position to do was the kinds of major reforms that would rebalance this incentive structure that Kevin is referring to. Right now, members of Congress have an incentive to be in Washington for fewer than 3 days a week when they're in session. Much of that time to raise money for re-election, and very little of that time actually doing the hard work of legislative reauthorizations, oversight, and the painstaking detail that goes into things like writing amendments and legislative negotiation. So what would need to happen would be a much larger holistic reform effort that would do a couple of things. One, it would go well beyond the low-hanging fruit and really try to restructure the Congress as a firm or as an enterprise, as Kevin was referring to make it function given the current political context. Two, the House Select Committee only dealt with problems in the House. Congress is two different branches, or two different chambers. And the Senate, the only really focus on reforming in the Senate, of course, in the past 2 decades has been Rule 22 and the filibuster and cloture reform. And that seems to be happening on its own, right? So the problem here is that the Senate is just as under-resourced as is the House. So I think really what the Select Committee was a model, I think, for what ought to be a much bigger step. There ought to be something like the Bowling Commission of the 1970s that included members of both chambers and included and were charged with developing recommendations that could easily be adopted through the legislative appropriations process and through the rules process. So it was a valiant start to what is a much bigger and deeper problem in the institution.
Kevin, let me combine a couple of questions here for you. It seems like in a populist moment like this, the case for resourcing Congress is very hard to make, whether for partisan reasons or for kind of cross-partisan populist reasons. To say we need more expertise, to say we need more careerism, to say we need more money in Congress is a huge challenge for people who have to face voters every couple of years. How would you suggest to a member to take up this issue and make this argument in a way that can speak to this moment in our political culture?
Yeah, it's a wicked problem. There's a chapter in the book by Anthony Madonna and Ian Ostrander, which deals with the public opinion issue. And it's been a problem for decades. Investing in Congress has always been a hard sale because, the public has the kind of myth of Cincinnatus mindset that all you need is good horse sense and you can walk into a legislature and probably rule pretty well. And governance is way too complex for that, with 170 federal agencies and a $4.5 trillion budget and all that. And so yeah, there's a basic perception problem there. When I have advised members committees about dealing with this, I've suggested that they don't go for the actions that can simply be construed as, oh, you're paying yourself more or you're giving yourself more staff, but to think about capacity in other ways. For example, there are the legislative branch support agencies, Government Accountability Office, Congressional Research Service, Congressional Budget Office. These are, to a degree, shared staff that all legislators can reach out to and rely upon to help them get stuff done. Funding those organizations, is not something the public is going to scream about. Then there are other things, that are way more in the weeds. When a member gets his budget to pay his office staff, what all expenses are included under that budget and what expenses could be moved to other budgets that are part of the House as a whole, administrative budgets. One of the things that, was worked upon in the last year was, a student loan repayment program for these college students who are coming and taking, free work on the Hill where they get nothing, or they get, $28,000 or something like that, and they have to live in a pricey city. They're trying to pay back their loans. Okay, well, if it doesn't come out of the member's budget, but instead comes out of a central budget inside Congress, that frees up more money for the member to raise staff pay or to devote to other resources. So there are ways to deal with this issue in a way that's low salience and less likely to get a member clobbered.
Well, thanks. We're getting now to the end of our time, so maybe I'll pose a single question the same question to each of you, and it has to do really with where we stand now after this particular 2020 election, where we seem to be looking at a next Congress that will be closely divided. The House is still Democratic, of course, but with a narrower majority than we've seen in a long time. The Senate, we don't even know, but whichever party controls it will have a very narrow majority. Is this a good thing or a bad thing from the point of view of advancing congressional reform? And are there particular ideas that you think might have a shot now because things are so tight? Lee, maybe I'll start with you. Are there causes for hope here, or is this election a step backward for reform? You're muted, Lee.
We almost made it through without one. You're muted, but not quite. But I'm a silver linings guy, so I'm going to look for the silver lining here. And I think the silver lining is that it's clear to I think everybody on all sides of the aisle that this kind of 50-50 nation, 50-50 governance situation is going to be here for a while longer. And, Democrats, I think, had this idea that they were going to get this sweeping, 53, 54 Senate seat majority and push through a bunch of major reforms that would give them sort of a semi-permanent majority status. And I think that's going away. And I don't think, Republicans have any illusions that they're going to be permanently rid of Democrats, or they might think that they will. But I mean, I think there's a moment now in which I think both Democrats and Republicans have to accept that we have to be in this balance of powers for a long time, and we're going to have to figure out how to make it work. And we can't just do this constant sniping at each other, because it's really destroying the fundamentals of our entire system of government. And my hope is that at some point we, both sides wake up and say, neither of us is going to win this war. And if we keep, digging deeper into these trenches, eventually we're going to be so deep in that we won't ever be able to climb out. And so having, as Tim said, having some sort of bowling commission, some sort of really let's think big about what are the possible futures of Congress. And I think we're going to need something more than the incremental low-hanging fruit. I think we need to look at the incentives outside of Congress as well. The system of elections, we've talked about the incentives, the sort of career paths. I mean, we've got to put a lot on the table right now. And maybe this moment of feeling really stuck is the moment in which we finally say, enough. We've got to do something different. Anything else is the definition of insanity.
Tim, on this point?
I agree with Lee in the sense that I'm also a silver lining guy, and with the caveat that reform in Congress will not happen overnight. It will not happen in the 117th Congress, but the foundation has been laid, I think, to get members to think more deeply about what their job as a lawmaker actually is. I do think that members of Congress go through an enormous amount of effort and time away from their family, in order to achieve something. And I think that they will soon learn that they can make their lives easier if they can simply look inward for just a little bit, put aside some other sort of sexier talking points that might work in a campaign, and be the true guardians of the institution itself. So, and this can be done through a number of small and relatively easy goals and objectives, but primarily towards, again, as Lee said, a bicameral, bipartisan, think big kind of organization. And I would add one last point, that it's not that the incoming president, the president-elect, spent more than 30 years in Congress himself, and I think he values the role that Congress can play. So it would be, at least I couldn't envision a pushback, if you would, from even within his, to members of his own party, if they were to try to seek to actually adopt some major reforms.
Kevin, final word. Are you also a silver linings guy?
I suppose I am. Are we going to get some sort of big bang congressional reform like we got in the 70s and in the 1940s? Not anytime soon, not least because the leader of neither chamber leader is into it. And if they're not into it, it's not going to happen. But I do think small ball congressional reform will continue. The Select Committee may or may not be reauthorized to continue its work. If it's not, that would be a shame, but the House Committee on Administration has been taking all these recommendations from the Select Committee and milling them into policies. And the whole process of having a Select Committee has basically taken a bunch of members and turned them into ledge branch reformers. Some of them have unfortunately left, like co-chair Tom Graves of Georgia is no longer in Congress, but others remain. And these are people who realize that, you know what, with a little time and a little bit of effort, you can move the ball forward and make Congress a little less miserable place to work, a little less frustrating place to work. So yeah, I think reform will keep churning forward.
Well, thank you very much to all three of you. Wonderful conversation on a very important book. The book is called Congress Overwhelmed. It's out now from the University of Chicago Press. Very highly recommended to you. And thanks to all of you for joining.